So what's supposed to happen when someone dies while they're in the care of the state? An investigation gets triggered, an inquest, a search for answers? But what happens when that whole process is itself broken? Today we're going to dive deep into the Angiolini review, which was this landmark investigation into deaths in police custody that frankly uncovered some profound systemic failings.
And this really gets to the heart of it. This is the devastating reality behind all the policy talk. These aren't just cases or statistics. They're families, and they're trapped in this awful prolonged trauma where their grief is basically put on hold for years because of legal battles. This quote just powerfully sets the stage for why this review was so desperately needed, the sheer human cost of a failing system.
And that really brings us to the core question. See, legally and morally, the state has a duty to protect people in its custody. And when that fails, the investigation that follows, it has to be prompt, it has to be independent, and it has to be effective. The whole point is to uncover the truth, hold people accountable, and, this is crucial, prevent it from ever happening again. So the big question the Angiolini review asked was, is any of that actually happening?
Okay, so the first thing the review found was this really disturbing pattern. The people dying in or after police custody weren't just a random cross-section of society, not at all. Instead, they were almost always part of specific, really vulnerable groups that the system was just failing time and time again. And I mean, just look at this data. It's pretty stark. Nearly half, 46% of all those who died had known mental health concerns. Now, that's not a coincidence. It's a huge flashing red light that a health crisis is being met with a law enforcement response, and often with absolutely tragic consequences.
And this, right here, this is what that failure looks like in real life. Take the case of Martine Brandon. She was clearly in the middle of a mental health crisis. She needed medical help, but instead, she was just left in a cell. An inquest later found that staff had actually faked the records to cover up their neglect. Her death was a direct result of treating a health emergency like it was a discipline problem.
Another huge issue the review uncovered, a massive racial disparity. People from Black, Asian, and minority ethnic communities just have far more contact with the police. As you can see here, Black individuals are 6 times more likely to be stopped and searched. And that's not just a statistic. More interactions mean more opportunities for things to go tragically wrong.
And this wasn't just about interactions on the street, it bled into the investigations after a death. In the case of Sean Rigg, a Black man with a history of mental illness who died after being restrained, the investigation was supposed to consider race as a factor. It was right there in the terms of reference. But the Independent Police Complaints Commission, the IPCC, just didn't. They failed to do it in their first report. It was a massive omission that suggested a much deeper institutional bias. And then there are the children. The review found just a profound failure to protect them. In all 3 of these heartbreaking cases, the 17-year-olds involved weren't legally treated as children at the time. Their parents weren't told they'd been arrested, and they didn't get the support of an appropriate adult. These cases just show how a routine arrest can spiral into a devastating crisis for a young person if the right safeguards aren't there.
Right, so it's not just about what happens in the cell, it's about what happens after. And the review really put the entire investigative process on trial, focusing on the very body designed to ensure police accountability, the Independent Police Complaints Commission, or IPCC.
So, let's be clear on who we're talking about. The IPCC. They're supposed to be the public's watchdog, right? When a death happens, they're the ones who are meant to step in, run an independent investigation, make sure everything was done by the book, and find any wrongdoing. The key word in all of that is supposed to be independent.
But here's the massive problem the review dug into. Despite the name, families felt the IPCC was anything but independent. They talked about a culture where you have ex-police officers investigating their former colleagues. It just creates this profound feeling of bias. Now, the IPCC pointed to reforms like reducing the number of ex-cops, but the review found this perception of police investigating police was a huge barrier to trust and to justice for these families.
And that leads us right to the next big issue. Because if the investigation is flawed, well, you can guess what happens to accountability. If that initial inquiry is weak, the chances of anyone actually being held responsible just evaporate. The review found a gaping hole where accountability should have been.
Just look at this number. 0. It says everything. For over 15 years, not a single police officer has been successfully prosecuted for manslaughter after a death in custody. Even when inquests have come back with verdicts of unlawful killing, it's led to nothing. This statistic, more than anything else, just highlights this massive accountability gap right at the heart of the system.
And even when a case makes it to an inquest, which is the legal inquiry into cause of death, the process itself is deeply imbalanced. The review called it an inequality of arms. On one side, you've got the police and other state bodies with experienced legal teams, all paid for by us, the public. And on the other side, a grieving family who has no automatic right to legal aid. It's just not a level playing field.
Okay, so after all that, you might be thinking this is all pretty bleak. But the review wasn't just about pointing out what's broken. It was also a blueprint for how to fix it. It laid out this really comprehensive plan with over 100 recommendations aimed at rebuilding the system from the ground up to make it more accountable, more transparent, and more humane.
And you can really boil all of those recommendations down into 3 big buckets. First, real accountability when things go wrong. Second, creating a system that actually learns from its mistakes so we can prevent future deaths. And third, proper support for the bereaved families who are just thrown into this incredibly complex and traumatic process.
So on the accountability front, the review didn't pull any punches. It called for phasing out ex-police officers leading these crucial investigations. It recommended creating a special group of coroners, the officials who investigate deaths, who have the specific expertise for these really complex cases. And critically, it said that senior police leaders must be held responsible for making sure evidence like CCTV is protected right from the very start.
Next up, learning. Because one of the most tragic findings was that the same mistakes were happening again and again. The lessons from one tragedy just weren't being shared nationally. So the review recommended a new central body to make sure that when a coroner makes a recommendation to prevent future deaths, that warning actually leads to action, like mandatory nationwide training for officers.
And finally, and this is so important, the review brought it all back to simple humanity and support for the families. It recommended that families themselves should help train investigators so they actually understand the trauma they're dealing with. It called for guaranteed legal aid to fix that inequality of arms at inquests. And it pushed for immediate access to counseling, recognizing that these families are victims who need care, not opponents in a legal fight.
So what's the ultimate takeaway here? After hundreds of pages and all these recommendations, why does this deep dive into policy and procedure really matter so much? Well, because it's about the fundamental contract between a citizen and the state. You know, there's a quote in the review that just sums it all up perfectly. An investigation like this has 3 jobs: find the truth, fix what's broken, and give families the small comfort of knowing their loss might prevent another family from going through the same thing. The Angiolini review found that the system was failing on all 3 counts.
And that's the question this whole review leaves us with. It's a massive challenge. Building a system where the state, with all of its power and all of its resources, can actually investigate itself with real independence, learn from its worst errors, and deliver justice to the most vulnerable, well, that's the ultimate test of a fair and just society, isn't it?